Stage 2, from 77 to 81, give or take a year on either end. So we have this push at that stage 1 where the victims' rights movement is kind of got that young energy, and they're moving and they're getting all these firsts established. Nothing's happening nationwide, but you see the very first things popping up here and there. What happens is that you head into 1977 and LEAA ends. And so that money that was set aside to fund police officers to go to college, and the money that was set aside to keep running the National Crime Victimization Survey, the money that was set aside to fund the very first victim witness programs, gets scrapped. And also in 1977, we have a recession. And so we see reductions in federal budgets. All of that meant that the pie, if you look at the funding of the criminal justice or the crime victims' rights movement as a piece of pie, the pie shrunk. The problem is the number of crime victims didn't, and the number of crime victim programs didn't. In fact, the number of crime victim programs grew. And so what happened is you see a lot of infighting. A lot of organizations that have popped up and programs that have popped up around crime victims' rights that were working collaboratively together in stage 1 now started fighting with each other in stage 2 for who is going to still get a piece of that pie in order to survive, because without that funding, your program doesn't survive. So we see a lot of polarization. You see the national organization that worked for domestic violence and sexual assault split. And there was a National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and then there's a National Coalition Against Sexual Assault, although the overlap of victims amongst them is huge, like 60%. But it was this fight over whether funding should go to sexual assault or whether funding should go to domestic violence, because it's shrinking. You have parents of murdered children, their organization fighting with other organizations about who's going to get money from that pie. And so you see less movement forward and actually some movement backwards in the movement because of this internal struggle over shrinking budgets. However, there is some success at the legislative and congressional level. So at the legislative level, you see the very first state that passes a law that allows police officers to arrest in domestic violence cases on probable cause alone. Prior to this, they had to either witness the domestic violence, police officers did, or a victim had to sign the complaint. And if any of you have learned anything about domestic violence in your classes, that's very difficult for victims of domestic violence who are often threatened and intimidated by their offenders to turn around and sign a piece of paper that's going to put that person potentially in jail, right? Knowing that eventually that person's going to get out, and possibly sooner rather than later. So that first statute passed in 1977, or PC passed in 1978, and that was in the state of Minnesota, was the first time that a state said, police officers, we believe that with your training and your education, that we can trust that if you go to a domestic violence call, that you will be able to establish, like you have with other types of crimes, that some sort of violence has happened and that a crime has been committed here based on probable cause. And because of that, we're going to allow you to arrest. In 1977, a year before that, was the first mandatory arrest law, and that was in Oregon. The state of Oregon was the first state to require that if a police officer responds to a domestic violence incident, that they had to arrest if they met the burden of probable cause. The very first National Crime Victims' Rights Week, signed into law by President Reagan, occurred in 1981 and has been celebrated on a national scale ever since then. This year, it was the very first week of April. we generally fall within a week. Lots of times we overlap with the National Week. But this year, out of the blue, and they don't announce these things until like December, they decided it was going to be the first week of April. And so if you follow crime victimization, if you follow domestic violence or sexual assault in the media, it's also Sexual Assault Prevention Awareness Month. You may have seen a lot of articles coming out nationwide this past first week of April.